He raised his glass in front of 200 guests and toasted another woman. Not his wife. Not the woman who had managed his estate for 12 years, protected his reputation, and carried his household on her shoulders without ever asking for recognition. He toasted Charlotte Fairchild, and the entire room watched. Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Ravenshire, sat perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply reached down, removed her wedding ring, placed it beside her husband's untouched plate, and stood up. She never looked back. If that opening stopped you, cold, stay with me. This story goes places you will not expect. Subscribe to this channel, follow every part until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it truly began. Eleanor had learned somewhere around the 5th year of her marriage that a woman could disappear inside her own home. Not in any dramatic way. Not with a single argument or a single betrayal. Just slowly. The way a fire dies when nobody adds wood, not because anyone decided to let it go cold, but because everyone simply assumed it would keep burning on its own. She had been 23 years old when she married Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Ravenshire. How was 31? Brilliant, ambitious, admired by half of England and feared by the other half. He had chosen her from among a dozen eligible women, and at the time, she had believed that choice meant something. It did for a while. In the early years, Alexander noticed everything about her. The way she organized his correspondence without being asked. The way she spoke to his tenants with genuine interest rather than polite condescension. The way she could walk into a room full of hostile politicians and leave 3 hours later with every man in the room quietly on her side. "You are extraordinary," he had told her once early in their marriage, after she had smoothed over a dangerous land dispute with 2 neighboring estates. "I don't know how you do it." She had smiled and said, "I simply pay attention." And he had kissed her hand like he meant it. That was 12 years ago. Now he rarely noticed when she entered a room at all. The winter charity dinner at Ravenshire Manor was the most anticipated social event of the season. Eleanor had begun organizing it in September. By December, she had secured donations from 14 wealthy families, arranged accommodations for 6 out-of-county guests, negotiated a menu that satisfied the dietary requirements of 3 elderly noblemen and 1 prominent MP with gout, and quietly resolved a potential scandal involving a local magistrate and a missing land deed, all before Alexander had even confirmed his guest list. She did not mention any of this to him. She never did any more. It was not bitterness that kept her silent. It was something quieter and more corrosive than bitterness. It was the slow understanding that telling him would accomplish nothing. He would nod. He would say something polite. He would forget it by morning. So she simply did the work. Because the work mattered even if she no longer believed he noticed. On the evening of the dinner, Eleanor dressed carefully. Deep green silk because the color suited Ravenshire's winter colors, and because the estate's guests expected the Duchess to look like someone worth respecting. She wore the Whitmore emerald necklace not because she loved it, but because it was expected, and Eleanor had long since made peace with the fact that duty and desire were rarely the same thing. She came downstairs to find Alexander already in the dining hall, speaking with the arriving guests. He glanced at her when she entered, not at her face. Just a quick automatic sweep that confirmed she was dressed appropriately. Then he turned back to his conversation. Eleanor took her place beside him without comment. Lady Charlotte Fairchild had arrived in the county 6 weeks earlier, introduced through a mutual acquaintance of Alexander's from his London club. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, possessed of a sharp wit and a carefully cultivated manner that made older men feel intelligent and younger men feel chosen. She was also, Eleanor had noticed almost immediately, very deliberate about where she directed her attention. Not scattered, not social. Directed. Every compliment Charlotte offered to Alexander was specific. Every question she asked him was designed to prompt him to explain something he knew well, which meant he always walked away from their conversations feeling articulate and impressive. Eleanor recognized the technique because she had used versions of it herself in the early years of their marriage. The difference was that she had done it because she genuinely wanted him to feel valued. She was no longer entirely sure Charlotte's motivation was the same, but she had said nothing. Because what could she say? Your new acquaintance flatters you too skillfully. Alexander would have dismissed it as jealousy, and perhaps Eleanor acknowledged privately some small part of it was. Not jealousy of Charlotte. Jealousy of the version of herself she used to be, the woman who had made Alexander feel that way without calculating a single word. She had stopped calculating because she had stopped needing to perform. She simply was who she was. The problem was that Alexander no longer seemed to find who she was particularly interesting. The dinner began at 8 o'clock. 200 guests. 4 long tables. Candelabras burning. Crystal catching the light. The specific kind of formal perfection that took weeks to arrange and looked to everyone present entirely effortless. Eleanor ate quietly. She spoke to the guests on either side of her, the elderly Countess of Blackmore on her left, who was nearly deaf but deeply kind, and Sir Thomas Hadley on her right, a politician she had met 3 times before and whose wife had recently lost a child. Eleanor spent 20 minutes talking with him about nothing connected to politics, because she could see that he needed 20 minutes of simply being a person rather than a public figure. She noticed Charlotte watching her from across the table, not with hostility, with something more careful than hostility. Assessment. Eleanor looked back at her briefly. Neither of them smiled. Then Eleanor turned back to Sir Thomas and asked him the name of the child he had lost. Because that was the kind of woman she was. Because she had always understood that the most powerful thing you could give another person was your full, unhurried attention. Alexander rose from his chair at 9:45. The room settled. He had a gift for commanding attention. Always had. When Alexander Whitmore stood up in a room, people stopped talking. Something in his bearing, in the way he held himself, the way he let silence work for him before he ever said a word, made every person present feel that something important was about to happen. Eleanor set down her glass. She had attended 37 formal dinners with Alexander in 12 years of marriage. She knew his speech patterns. She knew he would begin with gratitude toward the gathered guests, acknowledge the county's charitable commitments, and close with something that sounded heartfelt, but was technically the opening of next quarter's donation request. She prepared herself to listen, the way she always listened, carefully, in case she needed to follow up on something later, while simultaneously managing the expression on her face so that it projected appropriate wifely pride. Alexander raised his glass. I want to say something tonight that I've been thinking about for some time. Eleanor felt something shift. That was not his usual opening. It is easy to praise people who are already praised, Alexander said. Easy to honor what everyone already honors. I want to do something different tonight. He paused. Eleanor's hands were very still in her lap. I want to honor someone whose quality of mind and genuine grace have made these past weeks significantly richer. He turned, not toward Eleanor. Charlotte, Lady Fairchild. The room applauded. It was warm applause. Generous. 200 people who had all looked forward to this annual dinner and who trusted the Duke to know what was worth celebrating. Charlotte lowered her eyes with practiced modesty, and Eleanor sat in absolute stillness, because she recognized every word. Intelligence, grace, inspiration. Those were not adjectives she had ever heard him use about her. Not in public, not in private, not in 12 years. And the worst part, the part that moved through her chest like something cold and final, was not that he had praised another woman. It was that he had used the words Eleanor had been waiting 12 years to hear from him, and he had used them for someone else. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying was something you did when you still believed the situation might change. She simply reached down very quietly so that no one watching would have caught the movement unless they were looking directly at her hands, and she removed her wedding ring. It came off more easily than it should have. She set it down beside Alexander's plate, the glass he had raised and never brought back to his lips. She folded her napkin, stood, smoothed the front of her gown with one careful pass of her hand, and then she leaned down just slightly and said in a voice quiet enough that only Alexander could hear, I believe you have already chosen the woman you want everyone to see. She walked to the end of the table, excused herself to the Countess of Blackmore, who was too deaf to hear anything but understood something in Eleanor's expression and pressed her hand, walked through the hall, and left Ravenshire Manor without collecting a single additional thing. Alexander did not follow her immediately. That was the detail that would stay with him longest in the years that followed. Not what he had done, not the toast, not the ring sitting beside his untouched glass like an accusation he hadn't been prepared for. What would stay with him was that he didn't follow her immediately. He stood there in front of 200 people and made a calculation. If he followed her now, it would confirm to every guest in the room that something had gone wrong. There would be whispers, questions. The charity dinner would become a social incident that would take months to recover from. So he stayed. He finished the dinner. He thanked the guests. He shook hands and accepted compliments and answered 3 separate questions about next year's event. And Charlotte, sitting across the table with her careful eyes and her practiced modesty, watched him make that choice. She did not smile. But something in her expression settled the way a person looks when a long-running plan reaches a certain point of no return. He found the ring when the last guest departed. He picked it up and held it for a long time. It was lighter than he expected. He had never actually held it before, he realized. Not like this. He had placed it on her finger at their wedding, but he had never simply held it, a small gold band worn smooth by 12 years of use, by hands that had worked constantly to build and protect and sustain a world he had been free to move through without thinking about the infrastructure supporting him. He went to find Eleanor. She was not in their bedroom, not in her sitting room, not in the library, where she sometimes went when she needed quiet. He checked the whole manor, moving faster as the silence of each empty room accumulated. Her lady's maid, a young woman named Agnes, who had served Eleanor for 4 years and who looked at Alexander now with an expression of barely controlled distress, told him, "Her Grace departed an hour ago." "Your Grace?" She asked for the smaller carriage. "I believe she has gone to Ashford Park, her family's estate, 15 miles northeast." Alexander stood in the corridor outside Eleanor's empty rooms. He thought about riding after her tonight. Then he thought, she'll need time to settle. She'll be calmer in the morning. I'll go in the morning and we'll resolve this properly. He went to his study and poured himself a drink. And that choice, that second choice in a single evening full of choices, would cost him more than he understood for months. By morning, he sent a note. The note was measured and appropriate, apologetic in tone without being specific. It suggested that they speak when she was ready, that he understood she was upset, that he hoped she would return soon. Eleanor received it in the sitting room of Ashford Park, at a writing desk that had once been her mother's, in a house where she had grown up, and where for the first time in years she was not required to be anyone other than herself. She read it twice. She set it down. She did not reply. Not that day. Not that week. And when Alexander finally came in person, riding to Ashford Park on the 4th day, because the manor was deteriorating in ways he couldn't understand, he found Eleanor in the garden, wearing a plain dress with no jewelry and no performance, speaking with her mother's gardener about something to do with the winter soil. She saw him coming. She did not walk toward him. She waited. "Eleanor." His voice came out rougher than he intended. She turned fully to face him. "I thought you might have come sooner," she said, and her voice carried nothing he could hold against her. No anger, no tears, no accusation. Just a simple factual observation. "I thought you needed time," he said. "You thought I needed time," she repeated. Not mocking, just making sure he heard himself. "Eleanor, what happened that evening was..." "Was what?" she asked. He stopped, because he didn't have a word for it that was simultaneously honest and not devastating. "I want you to come home," he said. "I am home," Eleanor said quietly, and turned back to her gardener. She was different here. That was the first thing Alexander noticed, standing in the Ashford Park garden, feeling like a man who had arrived at the wrong house. Eleanor moved differently, spoke differently. The careful, managed composure she wore at Ravenshire, that elegant, controlled stillness that he had always interpreted as her natural state, was not here. Here she laughed at something the old gardener said. A real laugh, unguarded, brief, and then gone, but entirely genuine. He had not heard that laugh in years. He was not certain, standing there with her wedding ring in his coat pocket, that he had ever understood how much of herself she had quietly set aside to become the Duchess he needed her to be. "I am not coming back yet," she told him when the gardener excused himself. "Yet," Alexander repeated, and he hated how much hope he packed into that single syllable. "I didn't say I was coming back at all," Eleanor said. "I said yet because I haven't decided." I took one step toward her. She did not step back, but her posture changed just slightly, just enough. "The house is all ready," he started. "I know," she said. "I imagine it is. The charity accounts. I can send instructions." "That's not what I—" He stopped, reorganized. "Eleanor, I need you to understand that what I said at dinner was not intended to diminish you." She looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said finally. Then, "That's what made it so complete," she said. He had no answer for that, because she was right. The most thorough wound is not the one someone inflicts deliberately. It's the one they inflict without noticing, because that one tells you exactly how much space you have stopped occupying in someone's world. She had not left because he hurt her. She had left because he had done it without even meaning to. And the gap between those two things was wider than anything he knew how to cross. He rode back to Ravenshire alone. The note from the household steward was waiting on his desk. 3 unpaid invoices. The accounts secretary could not locate authorization for. A dispute between 2 tenant farmers that had apparently been in arbitration for 4 months, and Alexander had not been informed because Eleanor had been managing it quietly, and no one knew who to bring it to now. A letter from a local charity organization asking why their quarterly correspondence with the Duchess had ceased. He sat down. He pulled the stack of documents toward him, and he began to read. The handwriting appeared everywhere. In the margins of estate records, on the backs of letters, in the logbooks no one had thought to update since she left. Decision after decision, written in Eleanor's careful hand. Problems anticipated, addressed, and resolved months before they could have become crises. Families quietly helped from charitable funds that she had managed with such discretion that he hadn't known they existed. Conflicts between staff diffused with a word in the right ear at the right moment. He sat at that desk until well past midnight, and what he felt, reading through 12 years of invisible work in the quiet of a house that already felt too large and too cold without her in it, was not quite guilt. It was something closer to the specific terrible grief of understanding. Too late, the size of what had been standing right beside you while you were busy looking elsewhere. He had praised Charlotte for her intelligence. He had praised Charlotte for her grace. And the woman, he should have been praising the woman who had built the entire world around him quietly and without complaint, and without ever asking for a single word of public acknowledgement, had placed her ring beside his glass and walked away, without looking back. Because she had learned not to expect him to notice, and that last detail was the one that undid him completely. Not that she left, but that she had left expecting nothing. She had not waited to see if he would come after her. She had simply gone. Like a woman who has understood at last that the door she is walking through has been open for years, and she simply never let herself walk through it before. He sat alone in the house she had built around him, and he began to understand the first hard true thing. He had not lost his wife the night of the dinner. He had lost her long before that. The dinner was only the night she finally believed it herself. Alexander had lived at Ravenshire Manor for 31 years. He had been born in the East Wing. He had learned to ride in the South Paddock. He had buried his father from the front steps and inherited everything: the title, the land, the weight of a name that had carried authority in this county for 4 generations. He had never once in 31 years felt like a stranger inside his own house. Until now. He stood in the main corridor on the 5th morning after Eleanor left, and he noticed something he could not immediately name. It took him nearly a full minute to identify it, standing there in the silence of a house that should have been moving with the ordinary business of mourning. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was broken. The floors were clean. The fires had been lit. Breakfast had been laid in the dining room at the correct hour. But the house felt like a watch that someone had wound and left running. Technically functioning, technically keeping time with no mechanism left inside it that understood what the time was for. Agnes Eleanor's lady's maid was the first person to come to him with a problem she couldn't solve on her own. She found him in the corridor and stood very straight, the way junior staff stood when they were frightened and trying not to show it. "Your Grace, the linen delivery came this morning. Mrs. Penworth, the housekeeper," she said. "Her Grace always reviewed the quality personally before signing the invoice, and she doesn't know if she should sign without that review, and the delivery man needs an answer by noon, or he'll take the goods back to town." Alexander looked at her. "Then sign the invoice, Agnes." "Yes, Your Grace. But Mrs. Penworth says Her Grace always checked the thread count on the kitchen linens specifically, because last spring there was a batch that came in below standard and caused a rash on one of the kitchen maids, and she's worried about—" "I understand," he said. "Tell Mrs. Penworth to examine them herself and use her judgment." Agnes's expression told him everything he needed to know about how that suggestion would land. "Mrs. Penworth says Her Grace had a particular method of checking—" "Agnes." His voice came out sharper than he intended, and he watched the girl go still. He breathed. "Tell Mrs. Penworth I trust her judgment. Sign the invoice. And if there is a problem with the linens, we will address it then." Agnes curtsied and left. He was in the study before 9 o'clock. By noon, he had been interrupted 6 times. The estate manager, a competent and experienced man named Briggs, who had served Ravenshire for 11 years, came to him after lunch, with an expression that suggested he had been rehearsing the conversation for some time. "Your Grace," Briggs said, standing at the door of the study, "I need to speak with you about the tenant situation on the North Quarter." Alexander set down his correspondence. "What situation?" Briggs hesitated. "The situation with the Calloway family and the Hester family, Your Grace. The boundary dispute." "I'm not familiar with a boundary dispute on the North Quarter." Briggs's expression shifted, not with surprise, Alexander noted, but with the specific, careful neutrality of a man who had already anticipated this response and found it exactly as difficult as he expected. "It has been ongoing for approximately 4 months, Your Grace. Her Grace was managing the correspondence and the mediation between both families. There were 3 letters sent and received, and a proposal on the table that both families had tentatively agreed to review. She never mentioned it to me." "No, Your Grace." A pause. "I believe Her Grace preferred to bring matters to you only when she required a decision that needed your authority specifically. Most of the day-to-day resolution she handled directly." Alexander stared at him. "Most," he repeated. "Yes, Your Grace." "How many matters like this are currently unresolved?" Briggs reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a man setting down something heavier than it appeared. Alexander unfolded it. It was a list. Not a long list, 14 items. But every item on it was a problem that had been in motion being actively managed and had now simply stopped because the person managing it was gone. He read the list twice. Then he set it down and looked at Briggs. "She was handling all of this." "Yes, Your Grace, and more that I may not be aware of. These are only the items where her correspondence crossed my desk." Alexander picked up the list and read it a 3rd time. "Why?" he said slowly. "Did no one tell me she was doing this?" Briggs said nothing for a moment. Then very carefully, "I believe, Your Grace, that we assumed you knew." Charlotte Fairchild came to call on the 7th day. She arrived in the mid-afternoon, sent in a card with a note that said, "Only, I heard the manor has been quiet this week. I hope all is well. C.F. Alexander should have sent his regrets." Howe was aware of this, even as he told his butler to show her to the drawing room. He was aware, the way you are aware of a wrong turn, while you are still making it clearly, with full understanding of the consequences, and somehow continuing anyway, because stopping requires a different kind of decision than you currently have the energy for. Charlotte came in without the performance she deployed in social settings. No careful modesty. No calculated questions designed to make him feel impressive. She sat down across from him and simply looked at him with something that seemed on its surface like genuine concern. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," he said dryly. "How long has she been gone?" "A week." "Have you been to see her?" "Once." Charlotte tilted her head. "And She told me she was home, Alexander said, meaning Ashford Park. A pause. Charlotte smoothed her gloves. Eleanor is a proud woman, she said. You know that about her. I know a great deal about her, Alexander said, and something in his voice made Charlotte go still for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. Of course, she said. I only meant sometimes proud people need to be courted back. They need to see effort. It isn't enough to go once. Is that your advice? It's an observation. She met his eyes. She doesn't want the apology, Alexander. She wants the gesture, something that tells her she matters more than your dignity. He looked at her for a long time. There was something that had been sitting at the edge of his awareness for weeks, shapeless and without clear edges that he couldn't quite resolve into a thought. Something about Charlotte, about the specific nature of her observations, about how thoroughly she seemed to understand the dynamics of his marriage for a woman who had only been in the county for 6 weeks. But the thought wouldn't form all the way. I'll consider it, he said. Charlotte smiled. It was a warm smile, and it didn't reach her eyes. Good, she said. She left 30 minutes later. And Alexander sat alone, turning that conversation over in his mind, feeling a discomfort he couldn't name, but couldn't dismiss either. He went back to the records that night. It had become a habit. After the house settled and the staff retired, he would take the stack of ledgers and correspondence files that had accumulated in Eleanor's absence and read through them, not with any specific purpose, but with the growing uncomfortable sense that he was reading the history of a person he had lived beside for 12 years without actually seeing. The charity accounts were the ones that struck him hardest. Eleanor had managed 3 separate charitable funds connected to the Ravenshire estate. One for tenant families experiencing hardship, one for the county hospital, one smaller and kept in a separate ledger with no formal name that she had apparently used for individual cases. A widow whose roof needed repair, a family whose harvest had failed a young man who needed an apprenticeship fee that his father couldn't cover. The individual fund was the one that stopped him entirely, not because of the amounts. They were modest 10 shillings here, £2 there. The total across 12 years was significant, but not staggering. What stopped him was the notes. Because Eleanor had written notes beside each entry, not accounting notes, personal ones. Names, circumstances, brief descriptions that told him not just that money had gone out, but exactly who it had gone to and why and what happened afterward. Mrs. Tanner, roof repaired, children home from cousin's house by Christmas. January 1873. Young Patrick Hale, apprenticeship with Caldwell. Ironworks began March. Writes to thank her Grace Still. The Norris family, 3rd child born, healthy mother recovering. They named her Eleanor. He sat with that last one for a long time. A family on his estate had named their child after his wife, and he had not known. Because Eleanor had never told him. Not from secrecy, not from resentment. He understood that now, reading her handwriting in the quiet of the study. She hadn't told him because telling him wasn't the point. The point was the widow whose roof was repaired and the baby born healthy, and the young man who had found his future. She had done all of it simply because it needed doing, because she paid attention. Those were the words she had said to him in the 2nd year of their marriage, when he had marveled at her ability to resolve a conflict he hadn't even known existed. I simply pay attention. He put his head in his hands. He had stopped paying attention to her so gradually, so completely, that he hadn't even noticed the moment it happened, and she had stayed anyway, had kept building, kept managing, kept protecting, until the night he stood in front of 200 people and proved publicly and unmistakably that what she had given him meant nothing to him at all. On the 10th day, a letter arrived from Ashford Park, not from Eleanor. From her mother, Lady Harriet Ashford, a woman Alexander had always found faintly intimidating, with the specific quality of intimidation that comes not from force, but from the perfectly calibrated expression of a person who has seen through you completely and decided for now to say nothing about it. The letter was brief. Alexander. Eleanor is well. She is not, however, ready to receive further calls. I trust you will respect this. H.A. He read it 3 times. The phrase he kept returning to was further calls. Not a call. Further calls. Meaning she had not only received his one visit, she had discussed it with her mother, and her mother had decided it warranted a formal instruction. He set the letter down. He thought about what Charlotte had said, about gesture, about effort that cost something. He thought about 14 items on Briggs's list, and a baby named Eleanor, and a stack of ledgers full of invisible work. And he thought about the fact that he had not once in 12 years asked his wife how she was. Not truly. Not with the kind of attention she gave to everyone around her, the full, unhurried, specific attention that made people feel for the duration of her focus on them, that they were the most important person in the room. He had never given her that. He had appreciated her in the vague, taken-for-granted way you appreciate the structure of a house while living comfortably inside it. But appreciation without attention was just another form of blindness. He picked up his pen. He began a letter to Eleanor that was not an apology. Not because he wasn't sorry. He was in a way that was still expanding every day as he understood more fully what he had failed to see. But Eleanor had spent 12 years receiving his good intentions. She didn't need more intentions. She needed something different. He wrote, "I have been reading your records. I do not mean this as an explanation or an excuse. I mean it only to tell you that I understand something now that I did not understand 10 days ago. You built everything I have been moving through without looking at the walls. I am looking now. I am not asking you to come home. I am asking only if you would allow me to write to you." He sent it that afternoon. Her response came 3 days later. A single line. "You may write." He read it standing in the corridor, his coat still on from the morning's estate work, and felt something move through his chest that he couldn't immediately identify. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope, not the loud, confident hope of a man who expects to get what he wants. Something quieter than that. Provisional. The hope of a man who understands for the first time that what he wants is not guaranteed to him, and that this understanding, uncomfortable as it is the beginning of something more honest than anything that came before. He wrote to her every day, not long letters. He was not by nature a man who expressed himself easily in writing, which Eleanor would have known, and which was perhaps why her one-line response had given him permission rather than invitation. She was not expecting eloquence. She was, he suspected, waiting to see what he would do with the space she had offered. He wrote about the estate, about the things he was discovering as he tried to manage what she had managed, and about how the experience of doing it was teaching him things that 12 years of watching it from a distance never had. He wrote Briggs came to me today about the Callaway and Hester boundary dispute. He explained the situation in full. "I read your letters. You had found a solution that satisfied both families without either one feeling that they had lost. I confess I would have simply made a ruling and expected them to comply. I understand now why they would have resented it. You were building something I was only administering." He wrote, "Agnes told me this morning that you used to ask each of the kitchen staff how they were sleeping. Not as a pleasantry. Genuinely, she said you tracked it, and when someone said they weren't sleeping well, you would ask a follow-up question a week later. I didn't know that. I should have known that." He wrote, "The Norris family's daughter is named Eleanor. I found it in your records. I don't know why I'm telling you this, except that it seemed like something you should know that I now know. That there is a child in this county who carries your name because of what you did for her family quietly without telling anyone. I think she is 2 years old." Eleanor's responses remained brief. She did not ask him to stop. She did not open up, not yet, not in any way that gave him clear ground. But she responded. 3 words here. A sentence there. Once a question, a careful, genuine question about how Briggs was managing the tenant situation that told him she was still paying attention to Ravenshire, even from 15 miles away. Because that was who she was. Even angry. Even gone. She had not stopped caring about the estate and the people in it. She had simply stopped pretending that caring about it was enough reason to stay in a marriage where she was invisible. The letter from the charity board arrived on the 14th day. It was addressed to the Duchess of Ravenshire, forwarded from the manor to Alexander's desk by mistake. He almost set it aside unopened, but the name on the return address stopped him. The Ravenshire County Aid Society. He opened it. It was not a letter requesting information. It was a letter of concern. Several board members had noticed that the Duchess had missed the quarterly planning meeting. Her correspondence, which had always been the most consistent and detailed of any board members, had gone dark. There were 3 families currently on the Duchess's personal aid list who had not received their regular quarterly assistance. Could the Duke please confirm that Her Grace was well, and could he advise when they might expect her involvement to resume? 3 families. 3 families whose quarterly assistance funded from Eleanor's personal charitable account, which she managed independently of the estate funds, had stopped when she left. He sat back. She had not taken the charitable funds when she left. She hadn't had time, or perhaps she simply hadn't thought of it, or perhaps she had made the decision in those first hours that she would not use the estate's resources for anything while she was gone, that she would step back cleanly and completely, and let whatever was invisible become visible on its own terms. But 3 families who depended on that assistance were now going without it, because of the same rupture that had sent her walking out of a dining room with her ring beside his plate. He read the letter twice. Then he did something he had not done in 12 years of marriage. He went to Eleanor's desk, not his own, hers. In the sitting room that had been hers alone, the room he had never entered without some specific reason. The room that smelled still faintly of the rosewood oil she used on the furniture and the lavender sachets she kept in the drawers. He sat down at her desk. He pulled out her letterhead, the Duchess of Ravenshire stationery ivory, with the estate crest, and he wrote to the charity board himself. He did not pretend to be Eleanor. He explained that the Duchess was temporarily indisposed, and that in the interim, the Duke would personally cover the shortfall for the 3 families currently on the assistance list. Effective immediately, to be continued until such time as the Duchess was able to resume her administration. He sent it with a personal bank draft. Then he wrote to Eleanor. He told her about this letter. He told her what he had done. He did not frame it as a gesture designed to impress her. He framed it as something he had done because it needed doing, and because he had been in her desk and understood for the first time that her desk was a place where real decisions about real people's lives were made every single day. I sat at your desk for the first time, he wrote. I understand now that I never should have left it so long before I did. Her response this time was longer than usual. She wrote, the Calloway family on the aid list have a daughter who needs spectacles. Dr. Marsh in town has the prescription. The cost is approximately 12 shillings. She has been squinting at her school books since October. He had the spectacles delivered the next morning. And when he wrote to tell Eleanor they had been delivered, she wrote back within the same day. 4 words. Thank you, she wrote. Then after a pause that he could feel even through the distance of ink and paper, that was right. He read those 4 words more times than he was willing to admit, because it was the first time in 14 days of letters that she had told him he had done something right. And what struck him, what he carried with him through the rest of that day and into the night, was not the praise. It was the specificity of it. She had not said good or fine or as expected. She had said right. As if there were a standard she was holding against a measure of what mattered, and he had for one small specific action managed to meet it. He had spent 12 years being the Duke of Ravenshire. He was only now beginning to understand what it meant to be worth one. Charlotte came again on the 16th day. He had not invited her. She arrived with another calling card and another note simply passing through, she said. She had been visiting a friend in the next village. She hoped he didn't mind. This time, Alexander did not tell his butler to show her in. He stood in the hallway and received her there, which was not standard, and which Charlotte would have understood immediately as a deliberate choice. She looked at him. Alexander, Charlotte. He kept his voice even. I'm afraid today isn't a good time. I only wanted to see how you were managing. I'm managing, he said. She studied him. Something in his posture had changed, and she was perceptive enough to read it. You've been writing to her, Charlotte said. It wasn't a question. That's between Eleanor and me, he said. Charlotte tilted her head. The warmth she usually carried, the careful, constructed warmth, flickered slightly. You're not going to make this easy, are you? "I'm not sure I know what this refers to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was for the first time a smile that didn't have anything warm behind it at all. "She won't come back the same, you know," Charlotte said. "Even if she comes back. She's different when she's away from here. Freer. You'd have to give her something she didn't have before." A pause. "I'm not sure you know what that is." "I'm working on understanding it," Alexander said. "That's not the same as knowing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. Good afternoon, Charlotte." He held her gaze. After a moment, she left. He watched the carriage pull away from the front of the manor, and the shapeless thing at the edge of his awareness, that formless discomfort that had been building since the night of the dinner, since Charlotte's first visit, since every carefully placed observation she had offered about Eleanor's pride, and Eleanor's needs, and Eleanor's likelihood of returning, began very slowly to take a shape he could look at directly. Charlotte knew too much, not in the way of a perceptive outsider, in the way of a person who had been studying something for a long time. Her observations were not general. They were specific to Eleanor's habits, Eleanor's vulnerabilities, Eleanor's precise emotional architecture. A woman who had been in the county for 6 weeks, who had appeared seemingly by chance in every social situation where Alexander and Eleanor had been visibly at odds, who had been present quiet and attentive every time the distance between husband and wife was most obvious, who had delivered at the charity dinner a performance of modest gratitude, so perfectly calibrated to Eleanor's precise soft spot, the need to be seen for her intelligence and grace, which Alexander had never publicly acknowledged, that it had cut deeper than any deliberate cruelty could have. Alexander stood alone in the front hall of his house, and the question that settled in his chest was not yet an accusation. But it was no longer a discomfort either. It was a question with a shape. And he had the quiet, cold certainty of a man who has been in business long enough to recognize the moment a deal has gone wrong, not because someone has done something obvious, but because too many details have lined up too neatly for the outcome to be accidental. He went back to his desk, and this time, instead of reaching for the estate ledgers, he reached for something else. He pulled out the 6 weeks of correspondence that had arrived since Charlotte Fairchild first appeared in this county, and he began to read it with completely different eyes. He read through the night, not quickly, methodically. The way a man reads when he understands that what he is looking for will not announce itself, that it will be hidden in the spaces between ordinary things, in the gaps where something should be present, and isn't in the details that only become visible when you are looking for them specifically, instead of letting them pass as background. The first letter he pulled was Charlotte's introduction, delivered to him 6 weeks ago through his acquaintance, Hargreaves in London. A note from Hargreaves explaining that Lady Fairchild was newly widowed, recently arrived in the county, known to their mutual circle, and would benefit from the local social connections that the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire could provide. Alexander read it twice. Then he set it aside and pulled Hargreaves's most recent letter, a social correspondence from 3 weeks ago discussing a club matter in London. He read it with new attention. Hargreaves mentioned Charlotte twice, both times in passing, both times in a tone that suggested familiarity. Not the warm familiarity of someone speaking about a friend of long standing, but the careful familiarity of someone who has been briefed on what to say. He couldn't prove that from a letter, but he felt it. He moved to the next file the social correspondence that had come in around the time of Charlotte's arrival. He was looking for anything that didn't fit. Any mention of Charlotte from a source other than Hargreaves. Any detail that established her in his social world before Hargreaves's introduction. He found one. A letter from Lady Pemberton, a county neighbor, written 3 weeks before Hargreaves's introduction arrived. Lady Pemberton wrote about a small gathering she had attended, nothing formal, just tea with a few women from the county. She mentioned almost in passing. That interesting Fairchild widow was there again. She asks the most particular questions about Ravenshire. Again. Lady Pemberton had written again, meaning Charlotte had been at a previous gathering as well. Meaning Charlotte had been present in the county's social orbit before Hargreaves introduced her to Alexander. Before, by Alexander's timeline, she should have arrived at all. He sat with that for a long moment, Then he went through the desk drawer where he kept social invitations, the ones Eleanor had handled as a matter of course, the ones that would have crossed her desk in the weeks before the dinner. He found 3 that mentioned Charlotte by name. All 3 had been on Eleanor's desk. All 3 were from gatherings that Eleanor had either attended or declined. All 3 were from dates that predated Hargreaves's introduction by at least 2 weeks. Charlotte Fairchild had been in this county present in the social world that orbited Ravenshire, asking particular questions about his estate, before anyone had formally introduced her to Alexander. He went still, because that meant one of 2 things. Either the introduction from Hargreaves was not the origin of Charlotte's appearance in his life, or Hargreaves had been primed to introduce her after Charlotte had already spent weeks establishing herself in the peripheral social network, the women's teas, the charitable gatherings, the afternoon visits that Alexander never attended, and therefore never saw that Eleanor had moved through constantly. The social network that Eleanor had managed. The one that gave any careful, attentive observer an extraordinary amount of insight into the inner workings of the Ravenshire household. He put down the letters. He was not a man who arrived at conclusions quickly. He had always believed that speed in judgment was the enemy of accuracy. But the shape that had begun forming the previous evening was now fully visible, and it was not a comfortable shape to look at. Charlotte had not arrived by accident, and if she had not arrived by accident, then the dinner had not unfolded by accident either. He went to find Briggs the next morning before breakfast. Briggs found him in the stables, which was not where the estate manager expected to find the Duke at 6 in the morning, and his expression showed it. "Your Grace." "I have a question," Alexander said without preamble. "And I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." Briggs straightened. "Yes, Your Grace. In the weeks before the charity dinner, did anything happen in this house that was unusual? Any correspondence that went missing? Any situation that was misrepresented to me?" Briggs was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know. The quiet of a man deciding how much honesty he was being truly invited to offer. "Briggs," Alexander said, "I am asking." "There was one matter," Briggs said carefully. "In October, a letter came from the County Aid Board addressed to Her Grace, as her usual correspondence from them came. Normally, Agnes would have placed it on Her Grace's desk. But that particular letter was placed on your desk instead. I noticed it afterward because I saw the envelope in your study when I came to discuss the harvest reports, and I thought it unusual." "Did Eleanor know about the letter?" "She never mentioned it, Your Grace. And the board, as I understand it, received no reply from Her Grace at the time, which was also unusual. One letter misrouted. On its own, nothing. Letters were misrouted. Staff made mistakes. But combined with what else he was finding, it was not nothing. It was a small, precise interference that would have created the impression to the charity board that Eleanor was becoming inattentive. And it would have been invisible unless someone was actively looking. "One more question," Alexander said. "Who in this house had access to Her Grace's correspondence?" Briggs met his eyes. "Her Grace's lady's maid. Myself on occasion when estate matters required coordination. And," he paused, "Lady Fairchild visited the manor 3 times in October, Your Grace. On 2 of those occasions, she spent time in the East drawing room while Her Grace was occupied elsewhere. Agnes served them both tea." "In the East drawing room," Alexander said. "The East drawing room. Adjacent to Eleanor's private sitting room, where her personal desk stood, where her correspondence was kept, where the records she maintained had been sitting day after day in the quiet confidence of a woman who had never had reason to lock her own belongings in her own home." Alexander walked back inside. He moved directly to Eleanor's sitting room and stood at her desk. He did not touch anything. He simply stood and understood in the full weight of what that understanding meant, that he had brought a stranger into this house and given her through his own obliviousness access to everything his wife had built. The next piece came from Agnes. He found her mid-morning and asked her to sit down, which surprised her enough that she looked briefly alarmed. "Agnes," he said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to know that nothing you say will reflect badly on you. Do you understand?" She nodded, still wary. "When Lady Fairchild visited in October, the visits to the East drawing room, did you observe anything that struck you as unusual?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. That told him she had been carrying something. "Your Grace," she said. "I'm not certain it's my place." "It is," he said. "I'm making it your place directly." She took a breath. On the second visit, the one in the last week of October, Lady Fairchild arrived early, before Her Grace came down. I left her in the drawing room for perhaps 10 minutes while I went to let Her Grace know she had a caller. She paused. When I came back down, Lady Fairchild was in the doorway between the drawing room and Her Grace's sitting room. She was not inside, she was in the doorway, but she was looking. Looking at what? I couldn't say exactly. "Your Grace, the desk, I think." She moved back into the drawing room as soon as she heard me on the stairs. Very smooth about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. She stopped. "I should have." "You didn't know?" Alexander said. "Is there anything else?" Agnes hesitated. Then, she asked me questions sometimes, about Her Grace. Not personal questions, they didn't seem personal. Things like how Her Grace managed her day, what time she rose, when she liked to take her correspondence, whether she ever seemed tired or unhappy. Agnes's jaw tightened slightly. "I thought she was just making conversation." I answered honestly. "I didn't—" "Agnes." He kept his voice level. "You did nothing wrong. Thank you." He dismissed her. He sat down at Eleanor's desk. He was doing that more and more. He noticed operating from the center of her world instead of his own. And he thought about what a careful person could do with 6 weeks of access to this kind of information. If you knew Eleanor's correspondence patterns, you could predict when she would be communicating with whom. If you knew her schedule, you could arrange encounters with Alexander during the windows when Eleanor was absent or occupied. If you knew what made Eleanor seem cold or distant, her habit of silence when she was hurt, her refusal to perform emotional vulnerability, you could shade those qualities in another person's mind as signs of emotional withdrawal, of a marriage already fading. You could build a picture, not with lies necessarily, with emphasis, with arrangement, with the strategic presentation of things that were true in a narrow sense, but deeply misleading in their cumulative effect. Charlotte had not invented the distance between Alexander and Eleanor. She had found it, studied it, understood its particular geometry, and then done everything possible to widen it without ever being seen doing so. The financial records were the final piece. He had not gone looking for them specifically. He had been working through the household accounts, something he had never done personally in 12 years of marriage because Eleanor had handled them, and he had trusted her handling without ever feeling the need to verify it when he found the discrepancy. Not in Eleanor's accounts. Eleanor's accounts were immaculate. Every entry precise, every expenditure justified the whole record of 12 years of household management as orderly as a legal document. The discrepancy was in the guest account, a small miscellaneous fund maintained by the estate for covering incidental expenses related to visiting guests, gifts, carriages, particular requests. Someone had made withdrawals from that account across October and November. 3 withdrawals, each modest, each attached to a generic description. Guest entertainment, miscellaneous hospitality, seasonal arrangement, total £22. On its own, unremarkable. The amounts were small. The descriptions were vague but not inherently suspicious. But the withdrawals had been authorized on days when Alexander was traveling and Eleanor was managing the estate alone, which meant the authorization should have gone through Eleanor. He checked Eleanor's handwriting against the authorization signatures. They didn't match. Not even close. Someone had signed Eleanor's name to £22 in estate withdrawals. He sat back. His first thought was, this is money. £22. By estate standards, this was inconsequential, a rounding error in a single week's household budget. His second thought was, it isn't about the money. £22 withdrawn from an account. Eleanor managed authorized with a forged signature spent on guest entertainment during weeks when Charlotte Fairchild was the primary visitor to Ravenshire Manor. It was not about the amount. It was about what it proved. Charlotte had not been impulsive. She had not been opportunistic in the spur-of-the-moment way of someone who saw an opening and took it. She had been methodical. She had been present in this county for weeks before anyone introduced her. She had studied the household from its peripheral social edges. She had gained access to Eleanor's private space. She had gathered information from staff who trusted her because she seemed harmless. She had spent estate funds to facilitate her own presence funds she had authorized under a forged signature, and then she had waited for exactly the right moment at exactly the right public event. And she had been there when he reached for a reason to say the words his wife needed to hear. And he had said them. To Charlotte. In front of 200 people. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window and stood there for a long time, not looking at anything particular, just giving himself the space to let the full weight of it settle. Because the discovery of Charlotte's manipulation did not, he understood with painful clarity, absolve him of a single thing. Charlotte had found the distance between him and Eleanor. She had not created it. The distance had existed, grown steadily incrementally through 12 years of his inattention. Charlotte had simply found it and moved into it the way cold air moves through a crack in a wall that the people inside have stopped noticing. The fault for the crack was not Charlotte's. The fault for the crack was his. What Charlotte had done was a crime against Eleanor. Against this household. Against the basic decency of human conduct. What he had done was a failure of a different kind, slower, quieter, more corrosive, and entirely his own. He needed to know which mattered more before he walked into whatever came next. He wrote to Eleanor that afternoon. He did not tell her everything yet. Not because he was managing information, he had done enough of that, but because he was not yet certain he had the full picture, and he would not bring her an incomplete account of what had happened and ask her to react to gaps. She deserved the whole truth laid out clearly when he had all of it assembled. But he wrote her something that was true. I have found things in the household records that I need to discuss with you in person, he wrote. Not by letter. They concern you directly, and they concern someone who has been present in this house. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking only if you would be willing to receive me, not as the Duke, not as your husband, but simply as someone who has information that belongs to you, and that you should have directly from me, rather than from anyone else. He sent it. He did not sleep easily. He thought about Eleanor at Ashford Park, going through her days with the unguarded ease he had glimpsed in the garden, speaking to the gardener without calculation, laughing without composure. And he thought about how long it had taken him to understand that what he had interpreted as Eleanor's natural stillness was in fact Eleanor's constant management of herself on his behalf. She had been performing composure for 12 years, not because she was cold, because the house required it of her, and he had never once asked whether it cost her anything. Charlotte had found that exhaustion and used it. He should have found it first. He should have found it years ago and done something about it. Eleanor's response came the following morning. Faster than usual, which told him that she had been awake when the messenger arrived, or that she had read it and answered without allowing herself time to deliberate, which was in his growing understanding of her, a sign that her response was instinctive rather than calculated. The letter said, "Come Thursday. Come alone." 3 words and a condition. He would have preferred 4 words. He would have preferred 5 or 10 or a full page. But he had 3, and he recognized them for what they were. Eleanor giving him exactly as much ground as she was currently willing to give, and not 1 inch more. He sent back a single word. Understood. He spent Wednesday preparing, not preparing a speech. Not rehearsing an argument or constructing a presentation of Charlotte's deception that would reflect well on his role as discoverer. He did not want credit for uncovering what should never have happened. He spent Wednesday organizing everything he had found. Every document, every letter, every account entry. He arranged them in order chronological from Charlotte's first appearance in the county's peripheral social world to the forged authorization on the guest account, so that Eleanor could read the full sequence herself and reach her own conclusions without him standing over her explaining what she was looking at, because that was what Eleanor would want. He understood that now. Not to be protected from information. Not to be handled. To be given the full truth and trusted to do what she thought was right with it. He put the documents in order. He added 1 page at the front in his own handwriting. Not the formal penmanship of his correspondence, but his ordinary hand, the one that emerged when he wasn't performing. He wrote, "I am giving you this so that you have what I have. What you choose to do with it is yours. I will not ask you to make any decision while we speak Thursday. I only ask that you know what was done and by whom, and that you know I am telling you because you deserve the truth, not because I expect it to change anything between us." He sealed the envelope. He lay awake for most of Wednesday night, not with anxiety exactly, with the specific alertness of a man who understands that he is about to walk into a conversation that matters, not with anxiety exactly, with the specific alertness of a man who understands that he is about to walk into a conversation that matters more than any conversation he has had in 12 years, possibly more than any conversation he has had in his life, and that he has no idea what the outcome will be. He had been a duke for 19 years. He had managed estates, negotiated land treaties, navigated political relationships, built alliances, and dissolved them. He was accustomed to rooms where he held the power. Thursday morning riding toward Ashford Park, with the sealed envelope in his coat and his wedding ring still in his pocket. He had been carrying it since the night he found it. Beside his plate, had never put it away in a drawer, had kept it with him every day, as a physical reminder of what he had failed to understand in time. He was aware that he was riding toward a room where he held no power at all. Not because Eleanor would be unkind, not because she would be cruel, but because she had nothing left to protect. A person with nothing left to protect is the most honest person in the room. And honest people, Alexander had learned in his years of business and politics, are the most genuinely powerful because they cannot be threatened with the loss of what they have already let go. Eleanor had let go. She had let go the night of the dinner, when she placed her ring beside his glass without anger. She had let go of the need for his recognition, his attention, his public acknowledgement of everything she was. She had let go with such completeness and such dignity that it had taken him 2 weeks of reading through her records to understand exactly what she had released. And now he was riding toward her. Not to take it back. He wasn't certain it could be taken back. He was riding toward her because she deserved to know what had been done to her inside the house she had built. Because the woman who had protected everything around her deserved at minimum someone to protect her interests now. Because the truth was hers. And because underneath all of it, underneath the guilt and the grief and the new painful awareness of everything he had failed to see, he was still in love with his wife. Not in the comfortable background way he had loved her for the middle years of their marriage. Not the way you love something you assume is permanent. In the sharp, specific, newly terrifying way you love something after you have understood what losing it actually means. He rode through the morning and did not rehearse a single word. Whatever he said on Thursday would have to be true, because Eleanor would know the difference. She had always known the difference. That was the thing about a woman who pays attention. She could tell the precise moment when a person stopped performing and started speaking. He had never given her that from him. Thursday, he decided, was where it started. Whether it was too late or not, that was not his decision to make. It was hers. Eleanor was in the front sitting room when he arrived. Not the garden this time. Not the deliberate distance of outdoor space between them. She had chosen an interior room. Her mother's house, her own ground, but a room meant for receiving visitors, which told him something about how she was framing this. Not hostile, not intimate. Precisely positioned between the two. She was sitting when he came in. She did not stand. He did not expect her to. He sat across from her without being invited to, because waiting to be invited would have been a performance of deference that neither of them needed. He set the sealed envelope on the low table between them, and he put his hands in his lap and he looked at her. She looked back. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have known each other long enough that they can occupy the same space without filling it artificially, and who both understand that what comes next is too important to rush into with noise. Eleanor spoke first. "You said in your letter that it concerned someone in the house." "Yes." "Charlotte Fairchild." It was not a question. He registered that the fact that she arrived at the name herself, without prompting, without hesitation. "You already suspected," he said. Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I noticed things," she said. "I didn't have evidence. I didn't trust myself to distinguish between what was real and what was jealousy. What did you notice? She was quiet for a moment, deciding he could see how much to say. Then she said, "She knew things about me that she shouldn't have known. Small things. The kind of things you only know if you've been paying sustained, deliberate attention to someone for longer than 6 weeks." She looked at him directly. "She mentioned once in passing that I preferred the West drawing room for afternoon correspondence. I had never told her that. You wouldn't have known that. It's not the kind of detail that appears in casual conversation." "How did she know it?" "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I just knew that she did, and I knew what it meant about how she had come to know it." A pause. "I told myself I was being unfair, that I was looking for reasons to dislike her because of what happened at the dinner." "You weren't being unfair," Alexander said. "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." He reached across and pushed the envelope closer to her. She picked it up. She broke the seal with the same careful deliberateness she applied to everything. No tearing, no haste. The clean removal of the wax. The way you open something you understand may change things. She read in silence. He watched her face and gave her the space to react without him managing her reaction. Her expression moved through several things as she read. Not dramatically, Eleanor had never been dramatic. But he was learning to read the smaller register she operated in, and he saw it. The slight tightening around her eyes when she reached the passage about the drawing room visits. The almost imperceptible stillness that crossed her face when she reached the authorization signatures. The long pause she took 3 full seconds, maybe 4, before turning the page where the forged entry was recorded. She read the full document. Then she read his note at the front again. Then she set it down. "She forged my signature," Eleanor said. "Yes." "To pay for her own visits, from the guest account I managed." "Yes." Eleanor looked at the envelope in her hands. "Using my account, my name, to fund the process of replacing me." He had no answer for that because there wasn't one. It was simply what it was, the specific cold-blooded precision of what Charlotte had done, stated plainly without any frame that made it easier to hold. "How long have you known?" Eleanor asked. "I started finding pieces 3 days ago. I had the full picture by yesterday morning." "And you came Thursday as I asked." She looked up at him. "You could have come sooner. You had the information. You asked me to come Thursday," he said. "You asked me to come alone. I respected both." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something in the region of recognition. The specific look of a person who has been told something they weren't certain they would hear. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. "That's what I came to ask you," he said. "The evidence is yours. What was done to you. What happens with it should be your decision." She was quiet for a long time. "You're not going to recommend a course of action." "I have thoughts," he said. "I'll tell you them if you want them. But I won't tell you what to do about something that was done to you without asking you first." Eleanor set the envelope on the table. "Tell me your thoughts," she said. He told her everything, not just the documentary evidence. Everything he had thought through since Wednesday, the shape of what Charlotte had done, the timeline of her presence in the county, the social network she had moved through to gather information, the way she had used access to Eleanor's private space, the way she had used staff who trusted her, the way she had built a picture of a marriage already cooling in order to step into the warmth she was manufacturing. Eleanor listened without interrupting. That was one of the things he had always taken for granted about her, her ability to listen completely. Not waiting for a pause to insert her own perspective. Actually listening, actually following the thread, actually tracking the logic of what was being said, rather than preparing her response. When he finished, she said, "She didn't invent the distance between us." He had expected many things from Eleanor in this conversation. He had not expected her to be the one to say that first. "No," he said, "she didn't. She found it and used it." "Yes." Eleanor looked at him. "I want to be clear about something, Alexander. What Charlotte did, the forgery, the manipulation, the deliberate engineering of that night, that is its own thing, and it deserves its own consequence. But it does not change what was already true before she arrived." "I know," he said. "I need you to say that you know it. Not just agree with me. Actually say it. He held her gaze. Before Charlotte arrived, he said, I had spent years living beside you without seeing you. Not because of anything she did. Because I stopped paying attention. Because I assumed that what you built around me would continue without requiring my awareness of it. Because I accepted everything you gave without ever asking what it cost you to give it. He stopped. Let that sit. What Charlotte did was a crime against you. What I did was a failure. They are different things, and I am not asking you to weigh them against each other. Eleanor was very still. Then she said quietly, That is the most honest thing you've said to me in 12 years. It landed. He felt it land. Not as a wound, as something more complicated. The specific sensation of hearing a truth delivered without cruelty, without performance, simply as fact. She was not trying to hurt him. She was offering him the full picture the way he had tried to offer her the full documentary picture of Charlotte's deception. She was holding up the mirror and keeping her hand steady. I know, he said. Then tell me the rest, Eleanor said. Tell me what you think should happen with Charlotte. He laid out the options. Charlotte had forged a legal signature on an estate financial document. That alone was actionable criminal, potentially depending on how the magistrate chose to classify it. The circumstantial evidence of her premeditated entry into the county, her gathering of information about the household, her deliberate engineering of the charity dinner situation. These were harder to prosecute formally, but combined with the forgery, they painted a complete picture that any magistrate in the county would understand. He could bring formal charges. He could use his position to ensure the matter was handled through the appropriate legal channels. Charlotte would be publicly disgraced. Given her status as a widow without her late husband's family to protect her reputation, the consequences would likely be severe. He told Eleanor all of this. Then he told her the other side. If we pursue this formally, he said, the entire story becomes public. Not just Charlotte's actions. Our separation. The dinner. What I said in front of 200 people. The fact that you left and have not yet returned. He held her gaze. I don't raise this to protect myself. I raise it because it is your reputation also. Your name is the one attached to everything Charlotte forged. Your name is the Duchess in the story the county will be telling. You should decide what version of this story you want the county to know. Eleanor was quiet. Then she said, You would accept any consequence to your reputation. Yes, including being known as the man who drove his wife away with a public humiliation and was then deceived by the woman he humiliated her for. He didn't flinch from it. Yes. She studied him. That's a harder thing to accept than I expected from you. I've had 18 days to think about what I'm willing to accept, he said. That list is longer than it used to be. She stood and walked a few paces. Not away from him, just into her own thinking the way he had learned she did when she was working something through. I don't want her destroyed, Eleanor said. He waited. I don't, she said again, as if confirming it to herself as much as to him. Not because what she did doesn't deserve consequences. It does. But I've spent 12 years watching what happens when power is used to obliterate someone rather than to correct something. It doesn't make things more right. It just makes someone else smaller. She turned back to him. What I want is for her to leave. To be unable to operate in this county, or in any county adjacent to it, in the way she has been operating. I want the forgery documented and held formally legally, so that if she attempts to approach another household the way she approached ours, there is a record. She stopped. But I don't want her prosecuted publicly. Not yet. Not unless she refuses to go. He looked at her. That is more generosity than she deserves, he said. I know, Eleanor said. It isn't for her. He understood. The generosity was not absolution. It was self-definition. Eleanor deciding what kind of woman she was going to be in response to what had been done to her, and refusing to let Charlotte's worst behavior set the floor for her own. I'll arrange it, he said. No, Eleanor said. We'll arrange it, together. That was the first time she had used that word. We. He felt it like a change in temperature, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. A shift in the air of the room. Together, he agreed. They met with the county solicitor the following morning. Alexander had arranged it, but Eleanor sat beside him at the solicitor's table as an equal participant, not as a witness, not as an adjunct to her husband's account, but as the person to whom the wrong had been done, and whose instructions were therefore primary. The solicitor, a careful man named Whitfield, who had known the Ravenshire estate for 2 decades, listened to the full account without expression. When it was finished, he looked at the documents Alexander had assembled, looked at the forged signature, and looked at Eleanor. Her Grace wishes to proceed without formal prosecution at this stage, he confirmed. Correct, Eleanor said. I want a letter sent to Lady Fairchild advising her that we hold documentation of the forgery and that we are prepared to file a formal complaint with the magistrate at any time. The letter should make clear that our decision not to do so immediately is contingent on her departure from this county within the week and her agreement not to return. Whitfield wrote, I would also like, Eleanor continued, a formal record filed with this office, not as a public complaint, but as a private document, so that if Lady Fairchild approaches another household in the future, and that household should inquire through appropriate channels, there is a record they can access. Whitfield looked up. That is well considered, Your Grace. It is the minimum that prevents this from happening to someone else, Eleanor said. That was all. No performance. No visible anger. She delivered her instructions with the same calm precision she had used. Alexander now understood to manage everything in his household for 12 years, clearly, thoroughly, with the interests of the right outcome at the center, rather than her own emotional state. He sat beside her and said almost nothing, because there was almost nothing he needed to add. She had the full picture. She had made the decision. She was executing it. Howe was there because she had said together, and he was learning what that word meant from someone who had never had the chance to use it this way before. Charlotte's response came 2 days later. Not through proper channels. Not through a solicitor's reply. She came in person, arrived at Ashford Park without a calling card, without warning, and asked to see Eleanor directly. Eleanor's mother, Lady Harriet, was the one who received the message. She came to find Eleanor in the morning room where Eleanor was having tea and reading, and told her with the particular economy of expression that made Lady Harriet formidable. Lady Fairchild is at the front door. She says she needs to speak with you personally. Eleanor set down her tea. Did she say what about? She did not. She seemed... Lady Harriet paused, which was unusual for her. Rattled. Eleanor considered for a moment. Then she said, show her in, and stay if you would. Lady Harriet's expression offered the closest thing to approval she typically permitted herself. Charlotte came in wearing the traveling clothes of someone who had dressed in haste, not disheveled because Charlotte was never disheveled, but not composed in the usual sense either. Her posture was still controlled. Her face was arranged. But there was something beneath the arrangement that Eleanor could see the way she could always see beneath arrangements, the face of someone who has understood that a plan has failed and is rapidly recalibrating. Eleanor, Charlotte said. Lady Fairchild, Eleanor said. She did not invite her to sit. I imagine you've received the letter from my solicitor. Yes. Charlotte glanced at Lady Harriet. Could we speak privately? No, Eleanor said pleasantly. We could not. A pause. Charlotte adjusted. I want to explain. I don't need an explanation, Eleanor said. I have the documents. I understand what happened. I'm not here to be convinced of a different version of it. I didn't intend, Charlotte. Eleanor's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You forged my signature. You spent weeks gathering information about my household, my habits, and my marriage. You used that information to systematically create the impression that I was emotionally absent from a marriage that I had been holding together largely on my own. And you engineered a public moment designed to humiliate me in front of everyone whose opinion matters in this county. She paused. Which part of that would you like to explain? Charlotte was silent. It was the first time Eleanor had seen her without something prepared. I have been to see your solicitor personally, Charlotte said finally. I understand the terms. Good. I would like to ask as a matter of personal request, not legal negotiation, that the record held by Mr. Whitfield not include my name in any document that could be accessed without my knowledge. Eleanor looked at her for a long time. "No," she said. Charlotte's composure flickered. "Eleanor, you came here hoping that speaking to me directly would change something," Eleanor said. "I understand that. You have been very effective at reading people and adjusting your approach accordingly. But I want to be clear, the record stays. Not as punishment. As protection for whoever comes after me." She held Charlotte's gaze. "I don't know what happened in your life that brought you to a place where this seemed like the right thing to do. I'm not going to ask. But I'm also not going to remove the one thing standing between you and the opportunity to do it again." The room was very quiet. Then Charlotte said, and her voice had lost some layer of performance that Eleanor suspected had been present in every word she'd spoken since she arrived in the county. "You're not what I expected." "No," Eleanor said. "I imagine I'm not." Charlotte left without anything further. Lady Harriet waited until the carriage had pulled away before she spoke. "Well," she said. Eleanor picked up her tea. "Yes. I would have been considerably less restrained." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I asked you to stay." Lady Harriet looked at her daughter. Her really looked the way she sometimes did when she thought Eleanor wasn't paying attention. "You're different," she said, "from the woman who arrived here 3 weeks ago." Eleanor considered this. "I think I'm just more myself," she said. "I had become someone who made herself very small inside a very large house. It takes a little time to remember your actual size." Her mother set down her own cup. "What are you going to do about Alexander?" It was the first time either of them had spoken his name directly since Eleanor's arrival at Ashford Park. Eleanor had been aware of this, and so had her mother, and both of them had allowed it, because some things have to reach their own time. "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. "He came to you with everything he found," her mother said, "before he used it for himself. He organized it and brought it to you and let you decide what to do with it." "I know. That's not the action of a man who is only sorry he got caught being negligent." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't." She was quiet for a moment. "It's the action of a man who is learning something. But learning something and having learned it are different conditions." "They are," her mother agreed. "And you are the one who gets to decide which he's in." Eleanor nodded. She sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. Not because she didn't know what she felt. She knew exactly what she felt had known since the Thursday meeting, since the way he had organized those documents for her since the solicitor's office, when he had sat beside her and let her speak, and said almost nothing, and not once tried to redirect her decisions back through himself. She knew what she felt. What she didn't yet know was whether feeling it was enough, whether feeling it was the same as being willing to go back to a place she had left, and whether going back would mean returning to who she had been there, or becoming someone new in the same walls. That was the question. Not whether she loved him. She did. Not whether he had changed. Something in him had changed. She could see, it could feel the difference between the man who had stood at a dinner table praising another woman and the man who had sat across from her on Thursday and said, "What I did was a failure, and I am not asking you to weigh them against each other." The question was, what did she need in order to return without losing herself again? And that was a question she would have to answer on her own terms, in her own time, before she answered it to anyone else. Alexander was waiting at Ravenshire when the solicitor's confirmation came through. Whitfield wrote to inform him that Lady Fairchild had confirmed acceptance of the terms, that her departure from the county had been verified, that the record had been properly filed and sealed under the terms specified by the Duchess. He read the letter in the study. Then he sat for a while and thought about nothing in particular, or rather about the specific quality of quiet that had settled over the manor in the past week. Not the cold, absent quiet of the first days after Eleanor left. Something different. Something that felt less like emptiness and more like waiting the way a room waits when someone has stepped out of it briefly and the warmth from their presence hasn't yet left the air. He had not asked Eleanor to come back. Not since the Thursday meeting. Not since the solicitor. Not in the letters he had continued to write about the estate, about the Calloway dispute, now properly resolved about the Norris baby, who had apparently begun walking about the spectacles delivered to the girl on the aid list, about the small ordinary details of a household learning to see itself. He had not asked because she hadn't decided. He knew she hadn't decided because Eleanor, when she had decided something, acted on it. She did not deliberate visibly. She deliberated privately, thoroughly, and then moved. The fact that she was still at Ashford Park meant she was still in the middle of thinking, and pressing her would not accelerate her thinking. It would only interfere with it. So he waited. He wrote. He ran the estate with the new, awkward, improving competence of a man learning a skill he should have understood years ago. He made mistakes. He corrected them. He asked Briggs questions he would previously have been too proud to ask. He sat at Eleanor's desk when he needed to think about household decisions, because something about that desk, the physical fact of the space she had occupied for 12 years, the particular angle of light it caught in the afternoon, helped him think about the house the way she had thought about it. As a living thing. As a collection of people whose well-being was the actual point. He did not know if it was enough. He was not certain it would be. But he was certain of one thing: when Eleanor came back. If Eleanor came back, she would not come back to the same man. Not because he was performing growth for her benefit. Because he had spent 3 weeks sitting in the evidence of everything he had missed, and you cannot spend 3 weeks in that evidence and come out unchanged. Not if you have any real understanding of what you are looking at. He had looked at it. He had not looked away. And on the evening the solicitor's confirmation arrived, he sat at Eleanor's desk and wrote her a letter about none of this, about a robin that had apparently built a nest in the East Gardens hedgerow, which Agnes had reported that morning, with a degree of excitement that suggested the event was of significant cultural importance to the household staff. And he smiled, writing it in a way that surprised him with its genuineness. Because this was what she had built here. A house where a robin's nest was news worth telling someone. He sealed the letter. He addressed it to Ashford Park. He had learned in 3 weeks of letters that the small true things were the ones that carried the most weight. Not the apologies, not the accounting of failures, not the formal declarations of understanding. The robin, the girl's spectacles, the baby named Eleanor, the small specific actual details of a life that was still here, still moving, still waiting for the person who had always paid the most attention to it to decide whether she was coming home. The letter about the robin arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor read it at her mother's breakfast table, and she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the managed, socially appropriate sound she had produced at dozens of formal events over 12 years of marriage. A genuine one. Brief, unguarded, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it out. Her mother looked up from her own correspondence. Eleanor set the letter down. "He wrote me about a robin," she said. Lady Harriet looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses. A robin. Agnes apparently reported it to him as significant household news. He wrote it to me in complete seriousness, as if he were filing an estate report. Her mother studied her for a moment. "And that made you laugh?" "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor thought about it. "Because he never would have written that 2 months ago. He would have considered it beneath the dignity of correspondence." She folded the letter carefully. "He's learning what to pay attention to." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, what are you waiting for?" It was a direct question, and Lady Harriet Ashford had never in her life wasted a direct question on anything she didn't genuinely want answered. Eleanor recognized the weight of it. She didn't answer immediately. She set the letter beside her plate and looked at her tea and thought about the question. Honestly, the way she had been trained by her own nature to think about difficult things without flinching, without softening the edges. What was she waiting for? Not for evidence that Alexander had changed. She had that. 3 weeks of letters, the Thursday meeting, the solicitor's office, the way he had organized Charlotte's documents and brought them to her and said the decision was hers. These were not performances. She knew performances. She had watched Charlotte perform for 6 weeks. She knew what calculated behavior looked like from the inside, and Alexander's recent choices did not have that quality. They had the quality of a man working something out in real time, making mistakes in real time, and not trying to hide the process. She was not waiting for proof. She was waiting. She understood finally for herself to be ready to go back without becoming who she had been there. That was the difference. That was the thing that had kept her at Ashford Park for 4 weeks, while everything in her understood that the situation had moved past the point where staying away was still about protection. She was afraid of the walls, not of Alexander. Of the specific gravity of that house, the way it had shaped her slowly and completely into a woman who managed everything and was seen by no one. She was afraid that if she walked back through those doors, she would feel that gravity again and slowly, without noticing, begin to compress herself back into the shape the house expected. That was the fear. And understanding it named and specific was different from simply feeling it. "I'm waiting to know that going back doesn't mean going back to who I was there," she told her mother. Lady Harriet set down her glasses. "And do you know that now?" Eleanor looked at her. "I think," she said slowly, "that the question is whether the house changed, or whether I have to change it." "Perhaps both," her mother said. "Perhaps both." Eleanor agreed. She picked up the letter about the robin and read it one more time. Then she set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision. "I'm going home," she said. She did not send word ahead. Not because she wanted to surprise him, this was not a moment for theater, but because she had spent 12 years in a house where everything was arranged and anticipated and smoothed in advance, and she wanted to arrive the way she actually was as herself, without preparation, in the middle of an ordinary morning. She wanted to see what the house was like when it wasn't performing for her. She came through the front door at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning. The butler, a man named Graves, who had served Ravenshire for 16 years, and who had the specific composure of someone trained never to show surprise, showed it. "Your Grace," he said, and the way he said it, the slight involuntary warmth beneath the formality, told her more about the past 4 weeks than anything she could have read in a letter. "Graves," she said, "is His Grace in the study? He is your Grace. Shall I?" "No, thank you." She walked through the house. She did it slowly, deliberately. Not because she was uncertain of where she was going, but because she wanted to feel the house again. Not perform it. Feel it. The weight of the corridor under her feet. The way the light moved through the east windows in the morning. The particular smell of old wood and beeswax, and she noticed this immediately, and it made something catch in her chest. Rosewood oil. Someone had polished the side tables in the corridor with rosewood oil. The kind she used. The kind Agnes would have needed to specifically seek out, because Alexander had never known or cared which oil was used on which furniture. Someone had asked Agnes. Someone had made sure the house smelled the way it smelled when she was in it. She stopped outside the study door. She could hear him inside, not speaking, just the sound of paper of movement, the ordinary sounds of a person working. She put her hand on the door. Then she knocked. The movement inside stopped. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. Hal was at the desk. Not her desk. She noted his own desk with a stack of correspondence in front of him, and his coat on the chair behind him, and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which she had never in 12 years of marriage seen him do in the study. He looked like a man who had stopped dressing for a role and started dressing for work. He saw her. He did not speak for a moment. He simply looked at her with an expression that she recognized, not because she had seen it on his face before, but because she had always known it was there, underneath everything. Waiting for the moment he stopped performing around it. Relief. Raw and unguarded and real. "Eleanor," he said. "I didn't send word," she said. "I wanted to see what the house was like in the middle of the day, without anyone expecting me." He stood. And Agnes used rosewood oil on the corridor tables. Something moved across his face. He didn't try to explain it or credit himself with it. He simply said, "I asked her how you preferred them." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I mentioned it." She came into the room and sat down, not across from him, not at the careful distance of the Ashford Park sitting room, but in the chair beside his desk. The one that had always been for visitors. The one she had never sat in because she had always stood, always been moving, always been managing something, rather than simply being present. She sat in it now. He sat back down. They looked at each other. I have some conditions, she said. I know. Do you want to hear them before you agree to them? Yes, he said. I want to hear them because they matter, not because I'm negotiating. She believed him. If I am here, she said, I am here as your equal. Not in name. I know what the law is, and I'm not asking for what the law doesn't allow. I mean in practice. In this house. In our life together. The decisions I make about this estate are mine to make. I don't bring them to you for approval. I bring them to you when I want your perspective as a partner, not when I need your permission. Yes, he said. The charitable funds are mine. The management is mine. The decisions about who receives help and how are mine. I will share them with you if you're interested, but they are not yours to oversee. Yes. When something is wrong between us, when I am hurt or angry or invisible, I will say so. Directly. I will not manage it quietly and wait for you to notice. But I need you to also say something when you see me managing it quietly, because I have done that for so long that I don't always know when I'm doing it. He was quiet for a moment. That's the hardest one, he said. I know. I'll try, he said. I can't promise I'll always see it. But I'll try, and you can tell me when I don't. That's all I'm asking. Is there more? Eleanor thought. One more. Tell me. I need you to tell me when something matters to you, she said. Not the estate, not business. You personally. What you feel, what you notice, what you're worried about. I have spent 12 years knowing everything about how this house runs and almost nothing about who you are when nobody is watching. I want to know that person. Alexander looked at her for a long time. He's less impressive than the Duke, he said finally. Good, Eleanor said. I've had enough of the Duke. I'd like to meet my husband. The first week was not effortless. They were both too aware of themselves, too conscious of the dynamic they were trying to build, which meant that sometimes the effort showed in a way that felt slightly like performance. They both noticed it separately, and neither of them pretended it wasn't there. On the third day, they had their first real argument. Not about Charlotte, not about the dinner, about the North Quarter tenant dispute, the Calloway and Hester boundary matter, which Alexander had resolved in Eleanor's absence using a ruling that satisfied the legal question, but had not accounted for the personal history between the two families. Eleanor had read Briggs's summary and immediately seen the problem. They'll comply, she told him, because they have to, but you've left them angry at each other and angry at the estate. And next spring, when the boundary runs through the drainage channel, we'll have the same argument again with worse footing. I resolved it legally, Alexander said. You resolved it correctly, Eleanor said. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him absorbing the distinction. What would you have done? I would have gotten them in the same room, together, with a meal, and I would have let them yell at each other for an hour before we started talking about the boundary. Because the boundary isn't what they're fighting about. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what are they fighting about? The Calloway son courted the Hester daughter 3 years ago, and the Hesters ended it. The boundary dispute is the argument they're allowed to have instead of the one they can't. Alexander stared at her. How do you know that? Because I pay attention, she said. He sat back. Then he said, All right, what do we do about it now? Not what do you do. What do we do? She noticed the pronoun. She was certain he noticed her notice it. I'll speak to Mrs. Calloway first, she said. You speak to Hester himself. He respects you more than he respects me, even though he shouldn't. And this conversation needs to start from a place of respect. We compare what we've heard, and then we decide together how to approach the next step. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. It was not romantic. It was not a reconciliation scene from a novel. It was two people sitting at a desk, working out how to solve a real problem, and the ease with which they moved into it. The way they found a rhythm without planning to said more about what was possible between them than any formal declaration could have. That was the moment Eleanor understood that she had made the right decision. Not because everything was repaired. Not because 12 years of distance had been dissolved by 4 weeks of letters and one honest conversation. But because of the way Alexander had said, All right, what do we do without defensiveness, without protecting his earlier decision, without needing to be right, more than he needed to solve the problem. That was not the man she had left. That was someone new, or someone very old, who had finally been allowed out. 3 weeks after Eleanor's return, a letter arrived from the county aid board. They had heard that the Duchess was back in residence. They wanted to schedule the quarterly planning meeting. They had 3 new families on the needs list and a proposal for expanding the hospital fund that they hoped Her Grace would review. Eleanor wrote back and confirmed the meeting date. Then she set the letter aside and looked at Alexander, who was reading his own correspondence at his desk. They had started sharing the study, which neither of them had formally proposed, and both of them had gradually enacted, finding that the house felt less like 2 parallel lives when they occupied the same room at the same time. "The aid board wants to expand the hospital fund," she said. He looked up. "How significantly?" "They're proposing a new surgical ward. The costs are substantial." "What do you think?" She raised an eyebrow slightly. "I think it's the right thing to do if the money is there, but it would require drawing from the estate's capital reserve, which is a conversation for both of us." "Then let's have it," he said, and set down his own letters. They spent the next hour going through the estate finances together, not Alexander presenting, and Eleanor approving not. Eleanor managing, and Alexander being informed, but both of them at the same desk, both of them reading the same numbers, both of them reaching conclusions together. It was entirely ordinary, and it was the best hour Eleanor had spent inside Ravenshire Manor in 12 years. The grand winter charity dinner was held again in December. The same hall, the same families, the same gathering of county luminaries who had been present the previous year when everything had unraveled publicly, and who were all, every single one of them, present now, with the specific social attentiveness of people who understood they were witnessing something and were unsure yet what to make of it. Eleanor had organized it again. Of course she had. She was better at it than anyone else, and she had long since made peace with that being a fact rather than a burden. But this year, she had told Alexander what she was doing while she was doing it, not asking permission, sharing, telling him about the magistrate whose wife had just had twins and might need a quieter table, mentioning the new family from the north who would need introductions, explaining the 3 potential awkwardnesses she had already diffused before the dinner even began. And Alexander had listened, actually listened, had asked questions, had remembered the details by the evening of the event, and had spoken to the magistrate and the northern family with the specific awareness of someone who had been genuinely briefed by someone who genuinely knew what mattered. Eleanor had watched him do it from across the room and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Not the performed pride of a wife watching her husband succeed. Real pride. The pride of a person who has seen someone she loves doing better than they did before because they chose to become better. Dinner was served. The courses came and went. Eleanor sat beside Alexander at the head table, and for the first time in 12 years, she was not managing her expression, not monitoring the room, not preparing to smooth over whatever came next. She was simply present, eating, listening to the conversations around her, occasionally catching Alexander's eye across the table and watching him relay with a small, barely visible expression whatever he was thinking. They had developed that. A private language of small expressions built in the weeks since her return. A raised eyebrow meaning he had noticed something and wanted to know what she thought. A slight tilt of the head meaning she was managing something and would tell him about it later. Small calibrations that had emerged not from planning, but from 2 people paying attention to each other, enough to learn the other's shorthand. She hadn't realized how much she had missed being known, not watched. Known. At 9:45, Alexander stood. The room quieted. Eleanor set down her glass. She had no specific expectation. She had consciously chosen not to carry expectations into this evening, because this evening was not about repairing last year. It was about this year. Alexander looked out at the assembled guests. "I want to say something tonight," he said. "And I want to say it plainly, without the kind of diplomatic softening that makes things technically true and practically dishonest." The room was very still. Eleanor watched him. "Last year at this dinner," Alexander said, I stood in this room and said something publicly that I should have said years before that privately. I praised qualities that I was watching in a stranger that I should have been recognizing in my own house every day for the better part of a decade. He paused. I will not go into the details of what followed. Some of you know them. All of you deserve honesty over performance, and the honest truth is this: I failed to see what was most valuable in my own life until I was standing in the middle of the evidence of its absence. No one moved. Tonight I want to honor the woman who built this house before I understood what building meant. Who managed this estate when I was too occupied with running it to notice who was actually holding it together. Who protected families in this county quietly and without acknowledgement for 12 years, because she understood that the work was the point, not the recognition. He looked at Eleanor directly. My wife, Eleanor Whitmore, Duchess of Ravenshire. The room applauded. It was not the warm, generous applause that had greeted Charlotte's name a year ago. The easy applause of people following a social cue. This was different. This had weight. Several of the older women in the room were not applauding so much as watching Eleanor with expressions that suggested they had been waiting for this particular moment for longer than this evening. Eleanor did not look at the room. She looked at her husband. He held her gaze across the table, with the steady, clear attention of a man who has learned at some cost that this is the most important thing he can offer. Not the title, not the estate, not the public gesture, but the simple, sustained, specific act of looking at the person in front of him and actually seeing them. She did not cry. She simply looked back, and that the two of them, looking at each other across a table full of witnesses, without performance, without qualification, without the careful management of what the other person was allowed to see, was more complete than any speech, any apology, any formal declaration could have been. They walked the estate together after the guests departed. Not all of it, just the north path, the one that ran beside the hedgerow where Agnes's robin had built its nest in October. The nest was empty now, the season long past, but Alexander had apparently asked Briggs to leave the hedgerow untrimmed until spring. Eleanor noticed. She did not comment on it because some things are better acknowledged in silence. They walked without much conversation, and the quiet between them was nothing like the quiet of 12 years of distance. It was the quiet of two people who have said the important things and no longer need to fill the air to prove they are present. At some point, Alexander said, I owe you something that I'm not sure I know how to give. She glanced at him. What? Years, he said. I can't give them back. I know that. But I'm aware that I'm asking you to build something new inside a place where you already spent a long time being invisible, and I want you to know that I understand what I'm asking. Eleanor thought about this for a few steps. You're not asking me to forget what happened, she said. No. Good, because I won't. I know. What you're asking me to do, she said, is believe that the person you're being now is the person you'll keep being, and the only way I can know that is time. Then I have a great deal of work to do, he said. Yes, she said. You do. She said it without softening it. Not unkindly, but without softening it. Because she had spent 12 years softening things for him, smoothing the hard edges of reality into something more manageable, and she was not going to start doing it again the moment she returned. He heard the lack of softening, and instead of flinching from it, he said, I know, I'm going to do it anyway. She believed him. That was the thing. She came back to walking beside him in the dark, with the cold air of an English December pressing close, and the lights of Ravenshire Manor visible ahead. She believed him. Not with the uncritical, naive trust of a woman who had never had reason to doubt. With the careful, clear-eyed trust of a woman who had seen someone genuinely change under pressure, who had watched the specific way that change had happened, and who had decided that it was real enough to build on. Trust was not the same as certainty. She had learned that. Trust was the decision to move forward in the absence of certainty, based on evidence and understanding, and the full-eyed choice to try. She had made that choice. She would make it again every day as many times as it needed to be made. That was what love was. In the end, not the feeling which came and went with its own rhythm, but the recurring decision. The daily choice to turn toward someone and keep turning toward them even when it would be easier to turn away. She had turned away once. She had needed to. She did not intend to need to again. They stopped outside the front entrance. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. Her wedding ring lay in his palm. The small gold band worn smooth by 12 years of use. He had been carrying it since the night she left it beside his plate. She had suspected this but had not asked, and he had not offered it before now, understanding somehow that the moment had to be right rather than convenient. "I have been keeping this," he said, "because it seemed important not to lose it before I understood what it meant." Eleanor looked at it. "And do you," she said, "understand what it means?" "I understand that it means more than I knew when I put it on your finger the first time," he said. "And I understand that it's yours to decide whether you want it back, and when, and on what terms." She looked at him. Then she picked up the ring from his palm and held it herself for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of it, the 12 years contained in the slight worn-down polish of the gold. She put it on her own finger, not because he had asked, because she had decided. "It's mine," she said. "It was always mine." He looked at her hand, then at her face, and something in his expression broke open in a way she suspected he would not have allowed before, would have managed controlled kept interior. He let it show. She reached up and put her hand against his face briefly, one moment of contact, deliberate and brief, and then she turned and walked through the front door of her home. He followed. The following spring, the charity board approved the new surgical ward. Eleanor presented the proposal herself with Alexander. Beside her, not as his wife, but as the driving force behind the initiative, with Alexander there as her partner in the financial commitment. The board, which had known Eleanor for 8 years and respected her deeply, approved it without significant debate. Afterward, one of the older board members, a woman who had known Eleanor's mother for decades and who had watched Eleanor manage this county's charitable infrastructure with quiet efficiency for years, took her aside. "It's good to see you looking like yourself," she said. Eleanor considered the phrasing. "Have I not been?" "You've been magnificent," the woman said. "You have always been magnificent. But magnificent and yourself are not always the same thing, my dear." Eleanor smiled. "They're becoming the same again." "Good," the woman said. "We need both." She went back to Alexander, who was speaking with the hospital administrator about construction timelines, and she listened for a moment before joining the conversation, not taking it over, not managing it, just stepping into it as herself. He caught her eye as she joined them. She saw it, that specific expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he had noticed her, and was glad. She had spent 12 years waiting to be noticed. She was done waiting. She was here now, fully, wholly on her own terms, and the woman who walked into that room was not the Duchess who had managed herself into invisibility, and she was not the woman who had left a ring beside a plate and walked out into a cold December night. She was Eleanor. The woman who had finally learned that being seen was not something you waited for someone to give you. It was something you claimed for yourself and kept regardless of what anyone else did with their wine glass and their praise and their 200 witnesses. She had built this life. She had walked away from it. She had come back to it on her own terms, with her eyes open and her ring on her finger, and not a single ounce of herself left behind. And that was not a small thing. That was everything. A woman who knows her own worth does not wait for the room to recognize it. She walks in, takes her seat, and does the work. Not because someone is finally watching, but because